Okay, we're live. We'll turn it over to you, Judy.
Hello, my name is Judy Hawkinson, and I'm the Director of Philanthropy at the ACLU of Minnesota. As we recognize Dr. King's legacy, Black History Month in February and Women's History Month in March, I'm honored to welcome you to the first of 4 Lunch and Learn conversations where we explore the intersection between women's rights and racial justice. The series, titled Advancing Women's Equality, has been designed and will be moderated by Professor Michele Goodwin. Today's conversation will center on women, mass incarceration, and criminal justice. Professor Goodwin is the Chancellor's Chair in Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the Hastings Center, the organization central to the founding of bioethics. Her constitutional law scholarship is published in journals such as the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and Cornell Law Review, among others. Her writings and amicus briefs address freedom of speech, religious exercise, equal protection, due process, race and sex discrimination, reproductive rights, slavery, and LGBTQ equality, and is referenced by national media, legislators, and civil society organizations. Her most recent book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood, is available at your local bookstore or library. A nationally recognized advocate for civil liberties and civil rights, Professor Goodwin serves on the Executive Committee and National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union and as a member of the ACLU of Minnesota's Board of Directors, and also serves as our affiliate's equity officer. I am also honored to recognize the co-sponsors for today's event, the University of Minnesota Law School, American Constitution Society Minnesota Chapter, and Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. Thank you, Professor Goodwin.
Judy, thank you so much for doing all that you do, and the universe and all of our sponsors, co-sponsors. University of Minnesota is a co-sponsor, Mitchell Hamline, the American Constitution Society. It's a pleasure to be with you and also to our panelists. Today, we are joined by Aziza Ahmed. She's a professor of law at Northeastern University School of Law. Her forthcoming book, Feminism's Medicine, Law, Science, Race, and Gender in an Epidemic, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. We're also joined by Cynthia Chandler, who's the co-founder of Critical Resistance and Justice Now, and also the award-winning filmmaker, Erika Cohn, whose documentary, Belly of the Beast, is absolutely jarring for what it shows. Today's program builds out at a critical time in our nation's history. Just today, Lisa Montgomery, the only woman on the federal death row, was executed at 1:31 a.m. this morning. She had a calendar marking Inauguration Day. Joe Biden had promised to end the death penalty. We couldn't be coming together with a program at a more defining time in our nation. And to just give a glimpse of what we're talking about today in terms of women in mass incarceration, please take a look at the trailer of Belly of the Beast, which we'll share with you right now.
There is a culture of secrecy in California.
I have some fear. What kind of repercussions will I get for coming on and talking about this?
I've always been a fighter, but it wasn't truly birthed until I was in prison.
He did a pelvic exam.
He said I had a fibroid.
I was told that I had cancer cells.
When I came out, I felt like something was wrong.
We were getting hundreds of letters about medical abuses every month.
When was the first time a doctor told you that you may be missing your ovaries?
No one ever told me that. I had been intentionally sterilized, and I had been lied to.
The law prohibits sterilizing people in prison for the purpose of birth control, but they were doing it anyway.
One of the challenges with this story is you ultimately have to get to intent. And then that's when the doctor said, well, that's cheaper than welfare.
I was looking at these documents that was confirming, as a Black woman, my life wasn't shit.
What's going on?
I was very much intimidated by whom I was going up against.
The state has admitted that they have done these illegal surgeries, but we don't actually know who they did them on.
Women's become numbers. They don't get names. And that's what makes it easy to abuse them.
Women in California being coercively sterilized is absolutely revolting.
After all this pain, I'll never be the same.
We have yet to get an apology. We have yet to be acknowledged. The state has to be made accountable.
'Cause some wounds never heal. Do you see what you done?
That's a stunning portrayal. And joining us is the filmmaker of Belly of the Beast, Erika Cohn. Erika, what inspired you to do this film?
First of all, just thank you so much for having me. This is an incredible panel today with so many powerhouse women. Very excited to be in conversation today. So I started this film in 2010. A mutual friend had actually introduced me to Cynthia Chandler, and I was incredibly inspired by Cynthia's work and by her organization, Justice Now, which was one of the only organizations, if not the only organization in the country, that had board members who are currently incarcerated, informing strategy and informing policy from the inside out, as opposed to the outside in, as so many organizations work. And they had this campaign called the Let Our Families Have a Future campaign, which essentially exposed the multiple ways that prisons destroy the basic, fundamental human right to family. One of the most heinous, of course, being the illegal sterilizations, primarily targeting women of color. And immediately that to me screamed eugenics. You know, as a Jewish woman who grew up in Salt Lake City, the phrase never again was always profoundly in the back of my mind. And when I learned about this different kind of genocide that was happening through imprisonment, that was happening through forced sterilizations behind bars, I knew that I wanted to get involved. And initially that was as a volunteer. Cynthia invited me into the organization as a volunteer, where I later became a volunteer legal advocate. And really, from that work in providing direct services for over 150 people inside California's women's prisons, in collaboration with people who are incarcerated, this film was born.
So Cynthia, you were there, you know, and one of the participants, one of the individuals who was put in the film, Kelly Dillon, she wasn't able to be with us today, but Kelly turned to you, Cynthia, because she saw you in the prisons talking to women. Can you tell us a bit about her story and how you got involved with Kelly? And then from there, with the litigation that took place and also the legislative.
Sure. So by the way, your tech folks have terminated my video, so I can't come up on video. And for some reason, I can't hear you any longer either.
Okay, well, can you hear me now?
I've been asked, I can hear you now, and I've been asked to start my
All
video.
right.
So there we go. Hi, everybody. Okay, so, with Leading Justice Now, one of the things we started doing really early on, around 2000, was documenting how prisons function as a form of reproductive oppression, and prisons as an institution really acting to sterilize women. And we really early on, and this was because of the leadership of people in prison pushing us to really focus on that fact, that really prisons were functioning as a mechanism of fracturing families in the most profound way. And so we had been looking at sort of baseline reproductive care, looking at how families were being fragmented, and for a number of years. And then we got a letter from Kelly describing that she was a young woman in her early 20s, that she was having all these peculiar symptoms, which I read and immediately thought looked like symptoms of menopause, even though she was in her early 20s, and that all of this had started following a surgery, and that no matter what she asked her doctors, the doctors always were like, oh, nothing really unusual happened in that surgery. And so she had taken longer to recover. She had all these weird symptoms and no one would talk to her. And she was also really unable to get access to her medical records. And even when she did access them, unable to read them, because the average person in prison has an education level that's not even finishing high school or middle school. And medical records are not the easiest things to read. So she wrote to us, and it took quite a while to get her medical records. And then I had the incredibly unfortunate experience of having looked over her medical records and having to go into prison, meeting her for the first time, face to face, to tell her that I had learned she had been sterilized without her knowledge. And that was a profoundly horrible experience, even for me as a secondary witness to it. And we formed an alliance at that moment. By the end of that visit, we formed an alliance, not only because of the harms that had happened to her, but also because of the incredible level of white supremacy that influenced the fact that both of us as young women, I was about 30 years old, she was in her early 20s, both of us were sitting there. I was the person who had incredible level of economic and educational privilege and could read those records to her, right? And she was a Black woman, and I knew more about her body than she did because of institutional racism. And so I made a pledge to her that I wouldn't stop working until we figured out how we could make it change, like how we could make a significant change in our society so this wouldn't happen to other people, so that she would hopefully one day be made whole. And so that we could work together in challenging that kind of racial institutional injustice.
So one of the issues that comes out of this is just thinking about women in mass incarceration generally, which most people associate mass incarceration with men. And so they don't think about women at all. But it turns out the United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. Mm-hmm. And Kelly, why was Kelly behind bars to begin with? Because that tells its own story too.
Yeah, I mean, had Kelly been a white woman or a woman with economic power, it's very unlikely she ever would have been in prison at all. She was the victim of horrific domestic violence by her husband, who was a leader in a gang, a street gang in Los Angeles, and leaving with that intersection of domestic violence and gang violence, leaving that situation was not really an option. And she was repeatedly over and over again pushed away by the police when she sought help and disbelieved, because she, as a strong Black woman, could not possibly be a real victim. And she eventually, out of desperation to save herself and her children, killed her husband. And she was sentenced to a very long sentence as a teenager still, to serve in the Department of Corrections. And it is one of the most remarkable things for me about the film is it captures a moment when she's testifying in court where she's being deposed, actually, and she's asked, about what her plans are if she were to get out of prison. And she actually asks into the camera, like, can I hope? Like, am I allowed to hope? Asking sort of as a legal question, but very profoundly, like, what does society allow her to do, right? And she talks about her vision of what she wants to do in terms of intervention around domestic violence and gang violence. And in fact, that's what she's doing now. And so Kelly has really launched a whole new chapter for herself, where she is really one of the leaders nationally in looking at the intersection of domestic violence and gang violence and intervening in hundreds of women's lives and transforming them. And the idea, I'll end up by saying, the idea that someone so brilliant and inspiring could have so readily been wasted away in our institutions is such a tragedy, such an incredible tragedy.
And that's right. And that's one of the things that one sees from the film too, just how brilliant Kelly is, how vulnerable Kelly was. But what's interesting is we sort of think about the histories of women and mass incarceration and histories of domestic violence. You think about something like the rule of thumb baked into law, which provided that a husband could beat his wife legally, so long as the instrument that was used was no wider or thicker than his thumb. And so thinking about that as just simply being born out of a certain nature of violence and a certain anticipated nature of violence in our country against women that we just still haven't confronted. And we're right in the middle of COVID. And so even thinking about domestic violence during a period of time in which people are supposed to be home adds added layers to this. I want to bring Aziza Ahmed into this conversation as well. Aziza, I've known for a number of years. She's a prolific author and researcher who combines both sociology, law, and criminology, and the various things that she addresses, and constitutional law too. Aziza, can you tell us a bit about this book that you're writing now that further surfaces women and mass incarceration and also the HIV/AIDS crisis?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Michelle, for organizing us and for this conversation. This is really inspiring to be here with all of you and to hear everyone's stories. And, I think what people don't realize, and this comes out a bit in the clip that we saw, right at the beginning, she says, I wasn't even activated until I got to prison, that prison is a place where women come together and they organize against all odds, because as I've documented in my book, even organizing in prison is difficult. It can be seen as an act of insurrection. And in the 1980s at Bedford Women's Prison, what you had is really women mobilized together, mobilizing one another, creating safe spaces, all which could potentially have gotten them into trouble because they were so desperate to learn about how HIV/AIDS was going to affect them. Many of the women were mobilized by Kathy Boudin, the mother of Chesa Boudin, who just won the San Francisco DA election. She helped found an organization called ACE in prison, AIDS Counseling and Education. And from there came really amazing leaders like Katrina Haslip, an African-American woman who was imprisoned due to the war on drugs and for gender crimes like sex work that so many women are incarcerated for. And she became a huge leader and the face of a movement to actually change the definition of AIDS. So, we see this today now with COVID. We see that women in prison are having to advocate for hand sanitizer, advocate for cleaning supplies, even just advocate for clean air to breathe because the ventilation systems in prison are so bad. So, really, so much that we've seen in the past just keeps occurring time and time again, as we see in the documentary and has been said already.
And so, one of the things that I find really interesting, hearing your talk about women working behind the scenes and thinking about where we are now in COVID, is that as women were trying to bring attention, what they were experiencing, women contracting HIV and AIDS in America's jails and prisons, and they advocated. They went to EDC, they went to clergy. What was the story behind women not being a visible force, even though they were doing just as much activism as men were, who actually got attention for bringing attention to HIV and AIDS?
Yeah, I think a big part of that story is about gender and race. I think, as the AIDS pandemic has become more of a pandemic that impacts women, that impacts Black and Latina women, that impacts women in the global South, we see less and less attention to it. And this has actually been the problem from the get-go. Well, we see the problem increasing, but even from the beginning, the early days, we see that the stories of women of color were not represented in mainstream advocacy, that organizations weren't necessarily partnering up with those women's groups. And partly it's because the women themselves were making a set of claims for to address broader structural things that were affecting their lives: housing, welfare, child support, child custody. These were the issues. This is what AIDS meant to them, and child custody being a huge one. And these weren't the issues that were registering on the national agenda.
So I'll open this up to everyone. So why is it that these are issues that had not been opening up on the national agenda and still aren't? You know, what's amazing is that you have civil society organizations will say, okay, so we're working on criminal justice, but that's understood as we care about Black men and we care about Latinx men. As like, we don't see women aren't incarcerated, but you all know, and you tell a very different story. So what's missing here? Why is it that organizations and even government hasn't really put the attention on this? You know, I was stunned by, happy for the work that Eric Holder was doing, happy for the work that Barack Obama was doing. But one of the big galvanizing speeches that took place during the Obama administration, there are two, one before the American Bar Association with Eric Holder, and the other one before the NAACP with Barack Obama. And what was interesting about both of these speeches, right, which is like, look, this is a nonpartisan issue. We need to take care of mass incarceration. And if you read the transcripts of both speeches, they do not mention women, right? It's like, we need to take care of this and we need to look at what's happening to men. But there was no sense about women and the fact that, you know, most women who are incarcerated are mothers. When mothers are incarcerated, this means then that their children are placed in foster care. If you look at the statistics associated with foster care, they're horrific, right? When children age out of foster care, the data is basically at most 4% will be going on to college. If there's, for the girls, nearly half will have experienced some unwanted, unintended teenage pregnancy. A significant percentage will experience homelessness. And of the boys, it's somewhere to upward of 70% will have experienced some form of incarceration. And so it's interesting that given those impacts, right, those consequences, that there isn't attention on women. Why is that?
I think I know.
Tell us.
Okay, so, and I should preface this by saying that in 1995, I launched the first legal organization doing legal advocacy for HIV positive women in prison. And that was a peer-based organization that eventually merged into the founding of Justice Now. And all of our board members were women living with HIV and hepatitis C in prison. And we're part of that early organizing work on a national level from inside prison. I think if you look at the lessons to be learned, both from the activists in women's prisons and the issues that they're facing, that they highlight broader systemic issues than can be dealt with through reform. They highlight how the institution of imprisonment itself does act as a form of eugenics. It highlights how the institution of prison, through fragmentation of families and erosion of entire communities, functions as a system of slavery that alienates people from future generation, past and present. There is no way to reform that out of the system. And what we saw from all those players that you mentioned were specifically reformist work and even a real push for what I would call gender responsive prison expansion, rather than shrinking mass imprisonment, where they were looking, when they did look at women, they looked at women with such an incredibly gender rigid, antiquated, almost industrial revolution version of feminism, that they could only see that women were supposedly more docile, more likely to have survived violence, and we should create these very lovely, peaceful little prisons for women, but expand them all over the country, leading for more ways to expand imprisonment, really. But anyway, the reform, yeah.
Right? Because I'm loving where you're going, but let's think about this. You mentioned eugenics.
Yeah.
And so many people in our country, when they hear eugenics, they might think, oh, that's that horrible thing that happened in Nazi Germany, right? Like that was a terrible thing where the Germans went off the scales in a horrible way. And they don't know Buck v. Bell.
Yeah.
Right? And they don't understand that actually the first eugenics law passed by a major government, the United States, 1906 in Indiana. They have no idea that in 1927, the United States Supreme Court sanctioned eugenics when a Virginia law provided for the forced sterilization of people thought to be unfit. The test case that came from that is a 16-year-old girl who had been raped, 16-year-old poor white girl who had been raped and had a child at wedlock. And the state of Virginia wanted to sterilize her. and sterilize other people who were like her because they thought she was socially unfit. She was poor. It's alleged that her mother was an alcoholic and a prostitute. And so the state of Virginia thought that this is the person, these kinds of people like this are the kinds of who should not be reproducing in our country, and certainly in that state. And she was then taken to something they call the Virginia colony, which is where they have put these people they thought were unfit and wanted to sterilize them. And the case goes up before the United States Supreme Court. And what does the US Supreme Court say, Cynthia? Or Aziza?
Yeah, either one. You can answer if you want to, Aziza, or I can. But I mean, basically, the Supreme Court says, we can't. Two generations of imbeciles is enough, and we need to, and we should be justified in taking this, big stance and sterilizing people for the betterment, basically, of the white race within a capitalist society.
This is basically it, right? Yeah. So they, and in fact, what's interesting, given that we're in COVID time, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in addition to saying, so many generations are enough, better than to let them starve for their inability, that society can stop these people from continuing their kind. And he says that the laws that are broad enough for forced vaccination are broad enough to cover snipping the fallopian tube. And this has a racial component as well, because this became so frequent in the United States and in Mississippi that it became known as the Mississippi appendectomy, being forced on Black girls as young as 10 and 11 and 12 years old, who only later would find out that they had been forcibly sterilized. So how does this fit within the picture of mass incarceration?
I think that when you, I think that white supremacy infiltrates all of our institutions, and it's easier now for more and more people to see how white supremacy infiltrates policing or infiltrates prisons. We haven't yet fully, as a society, started to realize how it infiltrates family and the structure of the family. And what eugenics does is shows how the state has functioned to control the family, control who can have children, when they can have children, if they can ever have children, for the betterment of a white, economically privileged class, and to improve that class, right? And what's interesting to me also is how, when I said at the beginning that prisons function as a form of eugenics, when you take out women, increasingly more and more women, younger women, for longer and longer sentences during their reproductive years, even more so than with men, you see how prisons function as a tool to isolate people from their communities and thwart them from reproducing. And eugenics has continued in so many ways because I think of this way in which we haven't dealt with white supremacy at the root of our institutions. And I think it's even really shocking, not shockingly, but glaringly come up with COVID, with how we're also asking medically vulnerable people and elders to sort of sacrifice themselves to the economy. And that kind of white supremacy combined with capitalism is at the root of fascism and the rise of fascism. And that's why when Trump was elected, I wasn't actually surprised. After working for 20 years, and the campaign documented in this movie took place over 20 years. For working for 20 years, looking at how forced and coerced sterilization was happening in California's prisons, a liberal bastion, right? It was no wonder that fascism was rising. It was just no wonder.
Well, let's think about this, and I want to bring you back into this conversation, Aziza, and then get some feedback from you, Erika, just in terms of what it takes to bring something like this to the public, which is that when we're talking about these issues of the lives of women behind prison, in jails and prisons, and what that means, the sterilization is not something that's just in California. Can you give us some idea about the broader scale of what this means in terms of the harms to women's bodies in the carceral state?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we're thinking about sterilization, we're really thinking about these core issues of how the state attempts to control women's bodies. We see this we saw this all over the country as late as the 1970s. The state of North Carolina, until recently, was still giving a sort of a reparations, to women who were sterilized in the 1970s. I should say that I also, I worked with an organization for several years called the International Community of Women Living with HIV and AIDS. And the women who were sterilized that we documented in Namibia weren't sterilized in prison, but it was absolutely part of a broader project to say some women in the world should not be reproducing. And in that context, it was women who had HIV. And we saw this in Namibia, we saw this in South Africa, we saw people being required to take birth control before they could access AIDS medications. And so, it's just so deeply, it's what Cynthia was saying, it's so deeply a part of the fabric of our current political economy that is, really layered and imbued with white supremacy and sort of capitalist ideas about who good citizens are, who should be reproducing, who productive people will be in society, and how, and really puts the state at the center of determining who those people are. I think, Michele, too, this is kind of a segue to your book, because, that's something that we see a lot in your book, Policing the Womb. How are we going to regulate the bodies of poor women, of Black women, of Latina women in this country? And your book powerfully shows the role of the carceral state in managing women's bodies and punishing women when they are out of line.
Yeah, well, part of that book was, I thought that book was something that could be completed in 2 years, right? You just sort of look and examine from the ground what's happening in terms of this very aggressive policing of women's reproduction, which we really began to see during the rise of what was called the crack epidemic, right? Which was a horrible period of time in our country by the fact that government sought to utilize this dependency or use of crystallized cocaine and to use it as a means for incarcerating women and for creating various kinds of campaigns. And so what we saw were women being threatened with arrest or being arrested for having miscarriages if they told their doctor that they used an illicit drug during pregnancy. Women being charged with manslaughter for having stillbirth and things like that. But as I continued to write the book and became engaged with a number of organizations working across these issues, what we began to see was that for women who said, I don't want a C-section, we get threats by their doctors. You don't want me to have to call police and have them drag you in here. We began to see cases of women being arrested for falling down steps during pregnancy and being held in jail while prosecutors tried to figure out how are we going to charge her, for what it is that she has done. The case of Bebe Shwe, where I was an expert witness, a woman who attempts to commit suicide but survives, is charged with first-degree murder. And then the cases go on in this kind of horrific kind of display. If you look at Alabama right now, there are hundreds of women just within recent years who have been arrested and taken plea deals of 10 years, 20 years, et cetera, because they told their doctor that they used an illicit drug during their pregnancies. And all of this reminded me of work that I was doing in the Philippines some years ago. And I was struck by a person that I interviewed who works in civil society advocacy. And she told me because as a political prisoner, her children were put in jail with her. And I thought, well, how cool is it, right, that you would have children put behind bars with their mothers? But these days in the United States, for good behavior, your child gets to grow up behind prison bars with you. And that's a stunning thing. And it's something that we don't talk about. Erika, I'd love to hear from you, because doing a film like you did, it's not overnight. No. It's something that takes time. As I think about the book that I wrote, it took time working with Amnesty International and many other organizations on these issues, joining boards of organizations where we went into prisons and went into juvenile detention centers. It's horrific what we see behind bars once we put a gendered lens on it. What was this like for you doing this film? What's it like crowdsourcing, building the resources, trying to get people to understand that this is something important that they should want to know about?
Yeah, well, 10 years ago when we first started this project, we were in a very different world, and getting funding for this project was incredibly difficult. And part of that was people didn't actually believe that the sterilization abuse was going on. And part of it was that they didn't care. And I think, it really wasn't until 2013 when the Center for Investigative Reporting released their investigation through a series of articles by Corey Johnson, his incredible reporting between 2006 and 2010 on specifically the tubal ligations that were happening in California during labor and delivery. That was the moment when there was this real momentum, this conversation at a national level, potential for legislation, potential for some change to come from it. That was the moment that funders really started to believe in the project, and started to understand the importance of this. Of course, I think it's important to say that this is not just California. And I think a lot of funders and a lot of people along the way said, oh, this is just a few cases. This is not, mainstream, or, this is California. It's not the rest of the United States. And so throughout the 10-year journey of making this film, we also had a very intense reporting process that we were doing simultaneously. And we found through prison records and state audit records from California that nearly 1,400 sterilizations were performed between 1997 and 2014 in California.
Let me just pause right there. So that's California. California, which is perceived as liberal bastion, right? And California has in its state's constitution, a right of privacy that is specifically related to reproductive health rights and justice. So in California, with that in its constitution, you and your colleagues working on this film were able to document this high number of forced sterilizations and coercive sterilizations taking place in the prison.
And found that 8 states, we sent dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests to other states, and found that 8 states still today perform these procedures.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last time that we got together, we had the benefit of having Dawn Wooten on with us. So could you surface that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. I think, when we talk about why this continues to happen and what happened in Georgia just a few months ago, with the whistleblower Dawn Wooten coming forward and revealing the heinous human rights abuses that were going on in the Georgia ICE detention facility. I believe that these procedures continue to occur because there hasn't been accountability. There's been acknowledgement of our eugenics history. There has even in some cases been an apology. In California specifically, the governor in 2003 apologized for California's heinous eugenics past, but yet it was still going on. And so because these state actors and institutions who continue to perpetuate these heinous human rights abuses are not held accountable, these abuses will continue to occur. So actually, I just saw someone posted in the chat, what can we do to help? And I wanted to say, there's actually a reparations movement going on right now in California that I believe will set policy or, set a precedent for other states across the country to compensate survivors of forced sterilization for the harm that was done to them. So if you go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com, you can sign on to that petition.
Well, and here with your work and the work of Cynthia, we see this in the film, which has premiered on PBS, and you'll be able to let folks know where they can see the film. There was a lot of legislative efforts that you also combined in the work here, and Cynthia, you were working on, but you met resistance, and you also met resistance in litigation too. Tell us a little bit about the resistance that even after documenting these horrible things that took place to Kelly, and still you didn't have victories in court.
No. And you're mentioning the provisions in the California Constitution just made me so acutely aware in that moment of how we don't have access to justice if we don't have a just legal system, right? And you can have laws written in the books, but if you cannot enforce them, if you have no right to actualize those legal rights, then you don't really have a democratic legal system, right? A democratic rule of law. So we hit enormous resistance. So the sterilization abuse was already absolutely illegal, both on federal law as well as California law, even beyond the Constitution. And yet it was happening every time we went lobbying to talk to legislators about the fact that we had learned that the tubal ligations were happening regularly with pregnant people. And I should say we interviewed hundreds of people who were pregnant inside. We trained up about 150 people in prison to be trained as human rights documenters, and they were documenting and conducting surveys of their peers. And we interviewed through that process hundreds of people who are pregnant in the California prison system, and not one single, every one of them said they were asked if they wanted to be sterilized, which was illegal in and of itself. Not one of them said that they said yes. And we knew that hundreds had in fact been sterilized. So the question also became, did they even know, right? So when we would do this legislative work, we were met repeatedly over and over again by aides, as well as legislators themselves, with questions like, well, I mean, surely those women don't really want to have children anyway, do they? Surely they would be okay with this, right? Because we're doing them a service. And in fact, it started to become very clear, and we had a whistleblower who came forward and gave us documentation that the Department of Corrections Gender Responsive Strategies Committee had actually met to evaluate the efficacy of sterilizing people during labor and delivery. And it was the ultimate, what's the right word? Illumination, basically, of how you can have an ideal reform in mind of bringing like reproductive care into a prison, but then the culture of punishment will transform that into like a eugenic program, right? They really thought they were being helpful, but it was so paternalistic and racist, it was eugenic.
Yeah, and to tap into also what doctors who were performing these procedures were saying, we had the sense that this was serving an economic good for the state. So can you briefly touch on that? Because we've got a question that's come up in the chat. We're going to turn to audience questions. So if you have any, please put them in the Q&A. But this sense that, well, there's an economic benefit for the government.
Sure. I mean, the film focuses in on one doctor as sort of the villain figure of the narrative. But really, I just want to be very clear that the sterilizations took place at over 8 different hospitals, including two teaching hospitals in California. So this was actually much more than just one doctor. But the one doctor that was interviewed was very transparent in saying that he felt he was doing a service to the taxpayers, that this would mean less children in foster care, it would mean much less money spent, and the cost spent on these illegal sterilizations was far outweighed by the cost savings to the state.
I also think it's important to add, going back to what you said earlier, Michele, about, the whistleblower Don Wooten. In the process of making this film, we spoke to dozens of nurses who worked at different facilities and were horribly afraid of the potential of retaliation, having their pensions taken away. And so when we think of why these abuses continue to occur and we don't hear about them, the levels of secrecy and privacy these institutions hide behind, we often don't think about the retaliatory environment for those who work there and the fear that they experience in coming forward with stories. So wanted to also bring that back to Don Wooten and kind of her courageousness in coming forward.
Well, that's a very important point, right? Because it's not only the medical neglect, the coercion, but that for people who want to speak out about these issues, there can be backlash that they experience as well. So one of the questions that has come up that was placed in our chat relates to the experiences of Black women and the historical legacies of Black women being targeted by the state. And sterilization is just one slice of that. Aziza, can you speak a little bit to the racialized nature of sterilization or impositions on the bodies of women of color?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I mean, I think that that's basically a fact that, many of the women who are experiencing forced sterilization, that have been coerced into taking birth control, that have had their reproduction managed by the state, have been women of color. And, I think, the question touches on how we can bring those voices out. How can we really make sure that people understand what's going on? And I think a part of this is why I'm writing my book, which is the deep frustration I've had over the years about the fact that women's voices, that women of color in particular, their voices, their centrality to national movements, their centrality to changing and being integral to huge transformations that have brought positive benefits for everyone, have been virtually ignored or written out of the story. And part of this is, and Cynthia spoke about this, and Erika spoke about this, and Michele, you spoke about this, it's in your book, is the idea that we have to trust and believe women when they're saying and coming forward with the things that they fear have happened to them. A lot of what Cynthia described in how these early stories came out and came to Justice Now, and what Erika described documenting, is really resonant with my experience as well in documented cases of sterilization in the AIDS context, which is that people just don't believe you. They don't believe the women. They don't believe the advocates. They gaslight you at every turn, and it takes you really have to stand strong and say, I'm going to trust what these women are saying, because they know what's happened to their bodies.
Racialized too, though? I mean, do you think
Absolutely.
that part of this is because, historically, we didn't believe in the humanity of Black people at all, right? Like, this is a nation that was willing, not for just, if we were in a movie together and we saw people being bid on for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, afterwards, people would say it's gratuitous. Let's walk out of the film because things like this don't happen. There's a naked child on a block and is being bid on, and people are raising the price. And we would say that's horrible. But that didn't happen in this nation for just 10 minutes or 15 minutes. It didn't last 24 hours. We saw this as a pattern that lasted more than years, decades, flowing into centuries, like this normalization of considering a population of people as subhuman, as non-human. And, in some ways, one would have to say that these systems that we're talking about have a rooted nature in just that.
Absolutely. And, we see this in the very fact that Black people in the United States have basically had to build their own health infrastructure, and to create a place that's a place that you can feel safe to get healthcare and to access healthcare and to talk to providers. We saw the Black Panthers doing this in the 1960s and 70s, and their work was foundational for, other like movements. There were synergies with the women's health movement, with Our Bodies, Ourselves. I think that, people have unfortunately been told, Black people have unfortunately been told that you and experienced and that you cannot trust the health system on its face. You have to approach it with a deep skepticism. And we're seeing all this now too with the COVID crisis, the vaccine rollout, and it cannot be tossed aside. It has to be dealt with head on and taken very seriously.
So here are a couple of questions that are coming up. So one question, what are the most promising pathways to decarcerate women from prison altogether? What's your sense? Any of the panelists?
This is actually a very controversial question, right? Because you can start with doing the things that seem easier, like looking at drug charges or things that seem like where there's growing acceptance. But what we've seen over and over again, and particularly for women of color, is when you start getting lenient with some sort of more minor crimes, the charges levied against darker skinned women of color in particular go up, right? So they get treated as if they're harsher criminals, even if for the same conduct. So there's a growing movement that's really looking at what it would look like to start shifting significantly how we view even the most serious crimes. How do we start reinvesting in mechanisms of alternative dispute resolution and creating restorative justice and transformative justice for even very serious harms as an effort to actually whittle away at that bias and make room for decarceration of folks.
Anybody else would like to add to that, this question of how do we decarcerate? Well, how about this next question that comes up, which is, on this question of sterilization, which we've spent some time on today, how exactly might a formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated person know that they have been sterilized?
Part of the problem was that they wouldn't know. And one of our budget request in front of California is not just for reparations, it's also to mandate that the Department of Corrections in the state of California go through medical records and surgery notes for imprisoned patients in the women's prisons and men's prison system and look to see who they sterilized, and then it creates a mandatory disclosure provision. So they would have to not only make a right available, but make sure people are notified that they were harmed as well.
So we've got a question that's come in as well which relates to the reasons why we see the growing incarceration of women. And it's important to note that studies show that between the late 1970s and the early 2000s, that the rate of incarceration for women just dramatically increased over 800%. And in fact, the rate of incarceration for drug-related crimes for women by percentage exceed that of men. But do you want to address, what are we seeing? Why is it that women are being incarcerated? Why do we see the rates that we do?
Aziza, do you want to do that? Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I think what we saw, starting in the 70s and 80s is basically a push towards thinking about the criminal legal system as a way to address social concerns and social problems. And, this happened concurrently with the decline of the welfare state. So as people were receiving less social services, we were calling on the police more to address the social problems that were existing. And in the context of that, many gendered issues were sort of wrapped up in this greater expansion of the criminal justice system. So we have, a ramp up in the policing of sex work and prostitution. We have the targeting of trans women for these crimes, trans Black women in particular. As Michele's book documents, the war on drugs, led to the arrest and detention and harassment and policing of so many women of color in the context of the war on drugs. And so, I think that's part of the story that we have that explains what we see today, which is really horrific.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, and we have another question in our chat before we close out. It is, how do providers in the state of Minnesota help girls of color who are in the juvenile justice system that should actually be considered under safe harbor laws? And we'll expand that, right? So what are the kinds of things that can happen to help girls who are caught up in the juvenile detention system? And why is it that girls are being caught in the juvenile detention center? Your thoughts?
Part of what I feel is going on is actually, I think it's part of what's happened with the push against trafficking is the use of criminalization as some sort of alleged solution to people who are very vulnerable and to dealing with those vulnerabilities. And so more and more often we're leading to sort of a punitive response to vulnerable people, taking off on what Aziza was talking about, sort of the war on poverty and broader punitive nature that's certainly expanded to girls. And, and girls are even more vulnerable than women. So it makes sense that we're in that kind of a society that we're criminalizing them even more. I guess my words of advice for people who want to do reforms is that the leading question I have always asked myself for the last 30 years in doing this work for absolutely everything is, am I investing in people or the institution? And I think it's really important to invest in the people. So if you're doing work, you don't want to fortify the institution, because I promise you it will not fundamentally shift the conditions, and more money spent will just go into more bars. Think about how you can invest in, educate in, empower, build up the people inside. And then the second test question is your work actually shrinking the system? Or are you building the system and fortifying it through reform? And I just really want to end my comments on saying, reform organizations have to look at how we have helped build up the institution of mass imprisonment instead of helping shrink it. And we have to shift that and start asking about everything we do and what we invest ourselves in is, are we shrinking things down?
Well, on that note, I want to ask if there are any closing comments from our guests today, Aziza Ahmed, Cynthia Chandler, and also Erika Cohn. Any closing comments?
Thank you so much, Michele, for organizing this. This has been a wonderful hour and inspirational, and I'm excited to keep hearing more about all the amazing work that Cynthia and Erika are doing, as well as the ACLU.
I guess I'd like to just say even bigger than the issue of sterilization. I hope people watch the film and it inspires people to make change in whatever way you can. And I always challenge folks to think of one thing you can do to challenge white supremacy today, and do it. Because if we were able, as this like tiny little organization, to shift a law around this big issue, then it goes to prove that if we all band together, we can make bigger changes happen.
And Erika, before I close out.
Yes, thank you all for the amazing things that you've said. To add on to that, I just saw a question in the chat about what can we do to reform these institutions to encourage whistleblowers to come forward. To me, that all comes down to accountability. Again, I believe if we hold our institutions and state actors who have committed these harms accountable, we can prevent future abuses from happening. So go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com, sign our petition, which demands accountability, and bellyofthebeastfilm.com/watch. You can see the film in virtual cinemas, and please enjoy. Let us know what you thought of the film. Find us on social at BOTB Film and at Belly of the Beast Film. Thank you again, Michele, and to everyone else for joining.
And we also want to thank Lavona Andrews, who provides our ASL interpretation for today. Thank you so much. And as I close, on behalf of the ACLU of Minnesota, you've just heard that a system of mass incarceration that we have today is one that it's broken. It's one that's rooted in the histories and vestiges of slavery and white supremacy and has a terribly disparate impact on women and people of color. The impacts on women of color have yet to be fully acknowledged. And the ACLU of Minnesota is working hard with the national ACLU to end mass incarceration through lobbying, organizing, and also filing lawsuits. The ACLU of Minnesota is suing the heads of state and federal prison to force them to deal with COVID-19, which has spread like wildfire. 70% of the women in the federal prison in Minnesota have COVID. This and so many other issues should remind us all why it's important that organizations such as the ACLU of Minnesota and those who care about these issues, including our co-sponsors, are showing up to do the heavy work. And if you want to learn more about what the ACLU of Minnesota is doing, please check out their website, aclu-mn.org, where you can find more information. We thank you all for tuning in for this episode of this 4-part series, and we look forward to you joining us for the future episodes. And thank you all so much for bearing with us too, as there was a little bit of a glitch with that Zoom link, but we thank you for tuning in, for joining, registering, and please look out for our future events. Thank you, Judy Hawkins, for providing this lunchtime opportunity for the Friends of the ACLU of Minnesota. We will see you on February the 8th. Until then.